How self-reliant are we, really? The food edition.
We are attempting to lessen the grip that the industrial complex has on our lives by chipping away at how much our everyday lives depend on the outputs of this failing system. Industrial complex being the business of valuing profit above everything else, including the value of life, all of animals, including humans, and the environment. We made a previous video breaking down just how much we depend on the industrial complex for our everyday needs, including power and fuel, shelter, water, healthcare, communication, entertainment, transportation, sanitation, clothing, and pets. Our personal reliance on the system our society currently uses to produce, store, move, market, and sell the food we eat was left out of the last video as we felt it was just too big of a topic to lump in with the rest.
It's very complex.
Very complex. The cost to humanity in terms of the impact that the need of profit above all else has on animals and human welfare and the environment is just staggering. Add to that, the complexity is just shocking. And with no time like the present to really show how much it is like fragile.
Yeah, I'm sure people are really noticing right now what is going on.
And so growing and raising our own food to reduce our reliance on this system is one of the areas that we have put most of our effort and time into. The first projects on the Wilderstead have focused on building infrastructure, including a barn, a chicken coop, a greenhouse, and a hoop house, wood and storage sheds, and garden beds. For food production, we started with a blank slate. And when I say blank, I really mean that. Our house and where our livestock and gardens are occupy a section of our land that was clear-cut and stripped of everything. There was no soil here, so nowhere to plant. So over and above infrastructure, we have been rebuilding this ecosystem. We have also spent years building our knowledge of the environment, including how ecosystems function, our impact on these ecosystems, and what we gain from maintaining a healthy ecosystem, including clean water and air, wood, edible plants, mushrooms, fish. And that is one of the reasons that we called our homestead Wilderstead, not only because of how much we rely on the wilderness and what it provides, but to remind us of the impact our actions have on the wilderness. With all that effort, time, and research, you would think that we have minimized our reliance on the industrial complex. But when we put it down on paper, we were very disappointed in just how little we have loosened that grip.
I wouldn't necessarily say disappointed, but it was an eye-opener in how much work we still have to do just to make small differences, small changes.
Yeah, and it's these really small, important changes now that are probably going to be the biggest steps, the hardest steps we'll need to take.
Mm-hmm. The food seriously seems like the easiest step.
You'd think.
You would think.
Yeah.
But
similar to the last video, we laid out all the aspects of our needs and wants when it comes to food, and then we color-coded where everything comes from. Everything we rely on the industrial complex for is red. What we produce ourselves is Wilderstead blue. What we get from the wilderness is green, and what we get from our community is purple. We value all colors other than red equally, knowing that we can't produce everything ourselves, and it will take a community of like-minded individuals. Well, here it is in all its glory, and man, is that messy, and man, is that red.
yeah,
We want to show you this at this state so you can see just how complex it is. And we're gonna come back to this and kind of grow it as we go and we talk about it. But I also decided to visualize it in a slightly different way. We turned that jumbled mess into a bunch of pie charts where the size of the slice of the pie reflects the magnitude of influence of each source.
so this is our way of being transparent with you guys about where we're at and what it has taken just to get to this point where we are. We're roughly 6 years into this journey. We're going into our 4th year on this property.
Right, and we didn't really, those 2 previous years, we gained a lot of knowledge, but it's not like we brought a lot of resources over with us.
No.
So we had 2 years of practice and about 6 months of practice before that, and now 4 years of implementing it here in this environment at this location. Why don't we start with produce? That would be the one that we probably have put the most effort into. For produce, we're talking fresh, frozen, and preserved. And when I say preserved, I mean canned, dehydrated, smoked, all the different ways that you can preserve food. As you can see, there's a lot of Wilderstead blue here because we've been putting so much focus on our gardens. But there's still things we can't grow here. It's either the time of the year or just the climate. There's still some things that we rely on our community for, so you see that purple there. And there's also some things that we get from the wilderness. And so that is where we stand with produce. Next, we have meat and other proteins. We produce a lot of our meat here. We get a lot of it from our community, but we still buy some, and we get some from the wilderness. And when I say that, right now, that's limited to fish. Dairy and alternatives. That's a pretty one. We buy all that right now. Grains and baking, not much better. We buy most of that as well. We do produce some of that on the Wilderstead, and we do buy some of that from our community. We're seeing a trend here. A lot of red here in beverages, but we do produce a bunch of beverages on ourselves. We get some from the wild, and we get some from our community. Snacks are pretty red. But then we're getting to condiments where we're doing a little bit better, where we produce a lot more of that here, but we still have to buy some things that we cannot produce here yet. I've created pie charts as well for our garden and our livestock, and these are what we put into the garden and what we put into our livestock in order to grow our food. For our garden, we're able to use a lot of resources from the Wilderstead, but we do still have to buy some stuff from the industrial complex and from our community, and we do use a little bit of the wilderness to supply for our garden. For the livestock, the red is a lot bigger because currently we bring in almost all of the feed for our livestock, and that is one of the things that we are planning on changing specifically this year.
Yeah, that's going to be a big focus this year.
Okay, why don't we go a little bit deeper?
This is where it gets messy, folks. Really messy.
We have the snacks, produce, meat and proteins, dairy and alternatives, grains and baking, beverages, condiments. And then we also have up here our garden and our livestock, so we can show what's going in and out of those two things on the Wilderstead. And I've also broken things down into how we preserved it. We have smoked, dehydrated, canned, fresh, and frozen. Chocolate we can't grow here, but we can get that from fair trade, good sources. We know that is not part of the industrial complex.
Yes.
So that can be our community kind of input.
Or we can fiddle a little bit more with dandelion root.
Yes, because that smells like chocolate when you roast it. It's just a matter of then turning that into a tasty snack.
Yes.
Yeah. And nuts we can produce here, or we can get that from our community. And then stuff coming in from the Wilderstead, I have the line kind of coming in from smoked and dehydrated because we dehydrate berries and we eat that as snacks, and we also smoke and make meat sticks. Mm-hmm. And we've been using that as snacks, and they are delicious. We pretty nailed down produce in terms of producing most of that ourselves. The greenhouse will help, but right now we do buy some out-of-season vegetables, and we do buy fruits that we cannot grow right now in this climate. We keep on talking about putting a tree in there. So in our greenhouse, we want to have a fruit tree, and that can change. We can have one of those that has like multiple varieties, like oranges and lemons. All of that produce is coming from our garden. I've listed a whole bunch here of the produce that I could remember that we're growing, but garden has its own inputs, and so that's where some of the red is that we need to get rid of. So we do heat our greenhouse with wood, but we sometimes supplement that with electricity. We supplement light when we're starting seeds with electricity. We use water from the Wilderstead. We use soil from our community because, as we said, this was a blank slate when we got here. So we've been slowly trying to build up our own soil with compost, but we've also had to bring a bunch of soil in. We save as much seeds as possible, but it's also important to introduce new seeds into the seed bank of different varieties and from different sources to keep the genetics up. And some of that we buy from the industrial complex, and some of that we do get from our community.
Mm-hmm. I would say the majority we get from our community of new specific things that we want to grow.
Fertilizer, specific fertilizer we buy, we're working on creating that ourselves. But compost as a fertilizer, we produce that here with all of our animals and with all of our food scraps. That leads us into meat and proteins. Most of the meat and proteins that we consume does come from animal products, but we do grow beans here and we do have nuts here. We've tried peanuts, we have some wild nuts, and we do get some nuts from our community. In terms of meat, we grow our own chicken. We are starting with rabbit. We haven't consumed any of that yet, and we have had turkey, and I'm thinking of bringing them back again this year. And then there's eggs. In terms of from our community, we've started buying bison. We get pig from our friend, and we often get venison from people. And then we fish, and that's what we get from the wild. We do purchase some beef, nuts, and beans, but we are trying to get away from beef.
Yes, and because we have now found in our local community a family that is raising bison, that's the direction that we're kind of spinning in. It's a little more costly, but it does reflect the actual cost of the product, and that cost is being directly put back in to our community.
Yes, and when you buy from a small family farm, you know that they care about the humans that are involved, because that's them, that's their family. They know they care about the environment because that's where they live. And you know by just looking at the farm, you can go to the farm, you can see if they care about the animals or not. So that is a really great way of removing money from the industrial complex. And so our livestock that feeds into all those eggs, chicken, rabbits, and turkey, we need to feed them. So we buy a lot of the feed. So that's why that pie chart was so red, and that's one of the things that we're definitely working on this year. We do grow some feed already, and we're going to increase that. We get their water from the Wilderstead. In the winter, we do have to heat their water, and that's one of the things we're going to be working on this year, again, to try to find ways that we can rely less on electricity to heat their water. We bring all of the hay for the rabbits in from our community, and then right now we buy all the bedding for our chickens. That is a quick and easy one that we can work on this year to stop having to do it that way. There's so many ways that you can provide bedding for chickens that we could get from our property. There's leaves.
Yeah.
There's leftover kind of straw from the food that we're hoping to grow from them this year. There's many things that we can work on to try to decrease our bedding. One of the reasons why we currently rely on the industrial complex for so much of our animal feed is because it's really important to us that we're feeding them a well-balanced diet that's been created specifically for their specific needs. So as we start replacing that with food that we grow, we have to keep that in mind. We have to make sure that we're still giving them the right ratio of carbohydrates to protein and all the other essential nutrients that they need to be the best versions of themselves. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, so we gotta make sure that when we have laying birds that we're giving them enough calcium, and that when we have growing birds that we're giving them enough protein. And so these are really important. That's one of the reasons why we haven't just dived in right away and just started making their own food, because we really wanna make sure we can do it right.
Yeah, and I mean, they get a lot of Wilderstead produced food, garden scraps, all kinds of stuff. You know, if there's any plants in the garden that just we're not going to eat, into the chicken run they go. Straight in there and they eat them, but that is not a balanced diet if that's the only thing that we were feeding them.
For sure. And I did say we're trying to grow more of that ourselves, but also we're going to look at how we can source that from our local community as well, because a bunch of that we cannot grow ourselves here. We just do not have the pasture or open space to grow the volume of stuff that we would need. And then we have dairy and alternatives. This is a complicated one. So the reason why we got goats originally was so that we can produce our own dairy. We just weren't set up at that point to be able to properly raise goats in a way that we were not constantly just bringing in everything we feed them. And we couldn't see a way forward that we could do that anytime soon. And that's why we got rid of them. But they also probably would produce way more dairy than we consume because we don't drink milk.
No.
So the only dairy that we use is cheese, number one, mm-hmm. Butter, and Dave also, and I, like a little bit of ice cream every once in a while.
Especially in the summertime when it's hot.
For baking, we do use dairy, but for that, we have canned milk, like evaporated milk, condensed milk, and we have a lot of powdered milk. So that leads us into grains and baking. Again, this is something that we aren't able to produce much of that here yet, but we're looking at ways that we can cut back some of the stuff that we cannot grow here. For example, we have produced some like squash flowers that we can cut wheat flour with. But we currently do not have the magnitude of a source of salt that we would need here. So we're gonna have to look for a community to replace that. Sugar, we could replace that, as we mentioned before, with maple sugar, but we do currently bring a lot of that in so that we can develop our maple syrup kind of for in terms of giving away, selling, bartering, just paying for developing that whole system by it leaves the property. Vinegar, we produce our own vinegar. However, for canning and preserving food, you really need to make sure you have the right pH and acidity. We do not use our own vinegar right now for canning just to make sure we have it right, because you don't want to play around with that. Mm-hmm. And then there's rice and baking soda, oats, bread that we sometimes buy. We often bake it ourselves though, and noodles, which we buy, but we also make it ourselves here. And tortillas that we make ourselves here, but then we have to buy the corn flour. We've been looking into growing rice here. In our climate, there's the wild rice, which isn't a true rice, but we can replace a bunch of our rice needs with that. And there also are some other kind of rices that are grown in cooler climates that we could possibly grow here. And next we have beverages. We bring in all of our coffee, our pop, our hot chocolate, tea we get from our community and from the wilderness. We bring in some of our alcohol and we produce some of it ourselves here, but then we have to bring in the parts, some of the parts we need to make the alcohol and to produce it here, like the sugar and the yeast and sometimes even the berries. We get apples from our community. Coffee we get from the industrial complex, but mainly we try to get it from fair trade, organic companies that pay the producers well and are focused on eco-friendly methods, so we should probably consider that a community one. And then last but not least is condiments. We produce a lot of our own condiments here.
Almost everything.
Almost everything. We have soy sauce that we cannot produce and anything that contains soy sauce. And currently we don't make mustard, but we have realized that we could probably grow enough mustard to do that. Last couple years we have grown mustard in quite volumes. And we do buy ketchup every once in a while, but we are producing most of it ourselves here, along with maple syrup, hot sauce, relish, pickles, chili sauce, plum sauce, salsa, vinegars for adding into like salad dressings. Like we make our own salad dressing. So a lot of that is Wilderstead Blue. And then I didn't know where to put mushrooms, but there's mushrooms, and we basically get all of our mushrooms from the wilderness.
Yeah, I mean, there's a local mushroom producer that when we want very specific things like lion's mane, for example, we'll go to him, and those are the mushrooms we buy. I can't remember the last time that I'm talking years.
Yeah, it's been years since we've bought any mushrooms from the grocery store. When I made all the pie charts, I didn't do it in a quantitative way, it was very qualitative. However, it really does paint a good picture of how much we use of the different kind of sources. But if you were to piece each of those apart and then make an individual circle for each color, the picture is even clearer because now you don't have to worry about the different kinds of food. So let's just put all those different circles with the size of the circle being the magnitude of the influence of that on our lives. And as you can see, red is really big. And so the size of the circle is going to help us dictate this year what we're going to do to change that, because we don't want this. We want this. Because we know we cannot get rid of all the influence of the industrial complex on our lives. And we don't really want to, per se, unless we are willing to give up some of these luxuries and things that we really appreciate. Mm-hmm. So we did this whole experiment from last video to this one for us because we really wanted to put on paper and visualize where all of our stuff is coming from. But one of the best things about making that last video was you guys that contacted us and were saying, oh man, I really need to change that green and I need to change the blue. I need less red. And that was so cool.
Yeah.
It really made us happy about that. And one of the reasons why we tried to hurry to make sure we got this one out because of so many people asking, we need to know about the food. So we would like to know maybe in the comments about what you've done since that last video and how you've analyzed how these different colors are playing a role in your lives.
And keep building that community around yourselves and with us, especially if you're nearby. That's what we're looking for, is small producers of anything that you might be producing. It's worth something to someone, and it's worth a lot more to these people than the industrial complex makes it out to be.
For sure. And people have contacted us and said, I'm a soap maker. I'm gonna send you some soap and what can we trade for? Like, let us know, do we have something of value that you would like to trade with us for? Like, do you need maple syrup in your lives? And do you have something that we need that we've outlined as saying something that we're probably going to need to get from our community? So let's build that community. I'm really excited about this.